Good morning, everybody. Just getting ready to come and spend the weekend with you and looking forward to that. Appreciate your prayers as I travel on Friday to get there that night and look forward to seeing many of you over the weekend, but especially on Sunday morning when we gather for the monthly celebration service. Have a couple this month get with the All Churches Memorial Day picnic next week. But this was the weekend I was able to get with you. Melanie's not able to come with me with just responsibilities she has still here, not able to get away for that time. And we're going to a wedding the following weekend where she'll be away to my sister's daughter in Atlanta next week. So in any event, look forward to being with you. Wanted to complete the series that we began back in the fall on the BILD Encyclical, a circular letter among churches, on the gathering. Jesus' design for his church, not only what it is, but how it meets. There are two big ideas that we come away from, particularly in Paul's mind and in Paul's expression of what the church is. The church is a family of families, and the family of families meets in a certain way according to Jesus's design. And we talked about that and have been talking about a variety of topics and things within that or within those ideas over a number of years, whether it's in first principles or at a leadership level in a variety of ways. Now we've put that into motion at Grace Church. And we've done that not just as a matter of style or preference or practicality, but because it is Jesus's design. So my hope is that as you review that series, and even now in month 5 or more, I guess, probably going on 7, because given November is when we started the transformation and the reshaping of the way we gather together as a family of families, or as a small network of churches that is intended to grow and multiply over time, that you're feeling and getting more and more used to this as being the way in which we follow and obey Jesus. It really is a matter of obedience. It's not a matter of preference or style. Jesus intended and planned and has given us instruction that his church is to gather this way. And to this weekend's video talks about how we've gotten so far away from that, and particularly the key role of leaders in going back to those things and reshaping. Change is not easy. It is always difficult. But suffice it to say that, again, this is Jesus's intention. And because his spirit is behind that, we can depend upon, as we obey him, to meet with Jesus, to see him at work, and to see things happen that would not have happened otherwise. And sometimes it takes time, but he will take us and guide us through this. But we need to be committed to one another, just as we are committed to him through these things. It really is a matter of utmost importance, given where the church is today. We're in a time so much like the early church that, and we'll talk more about that this weekend. So I'll give you a brief overview on Sunday morning, as well as just a report on many things that are going on, sort of an apostolic visit is the way we think about these things, much like Paul and his team would do in the churches. That's the way we see our relationship continuing on. And but we'll have a time of question and discussion. So very important that you just watch the video here. There's a discussion guide, and there's a portion of the encyclical that you may have put away somewhere. I've included it in the email that will go out on Friday to read basically the 15 with three additional pages from one of the appendices. Look that over. Be prepared with your thoughts, comments, reflections, questions. Those are the things that the Spirit is teaching you through this, and the references of the ideas that it's carrying from the scriptures themselves. And we'll talk about it and learn together on Sunday. Learning is now a community exercise. It's not the work that one teacher does on behalf of everybody else. It's very important that in this way of gathering together. Everybody understands your preparation, just like the food and the things that you bring and prepare. You need to bring the things the Spirit has been teaching you through the week. That means you've planned time, you've disciplined yourself through the week to allow the Spirit to speak to you through the Bible reading, through videos, through the other things, through prayer. And you're taking notes on the things and you're bringing those to the gathering so that we can teach one another. This is the way the early church learned, not by a professional, highly trained speaker who stood in front and spoke to everyone else. That is a modern invention, and it doesn't grow and strengthen the church. We know that today by the fact that there are more churches than ever, but yet look at what our culture is doing. It is getting farther and farther away from God. It means we need to step back and say, is there something about the way we are thinking about church that's more culturally driven than the relevance and actually brings the transforming power of the gospel and the life that's lived after it to the culture around us as they go farther and farther away from the gospel. You don't keep doing the same things expecting different results. And the church over the years has had a slow movement away from what Christ has originally designed. We'll talk about it. Let me share my screen with you, and I'll walk you through the slides today, just some of the big ideas of this particular section of the reading. So this is the sixth of a series. This will be the sixth video in a YouTube list that we have on our YouTube channel. You have the other 5 that are there. You can go back and review them. I encourage you to do that from time to time. One of the things we can get trapped into is always looking for something new, always looking for some new teaching, rather than going on and deeply reflecting on and living with a matter long enough to really sink in and change who we are and how we think. So don't always be focused on the new things or the next things. We need to let the old things and the things that you notice in the teaching we've done over the years, much repetition. It takes repetition to change the way we think and transform the way we live. Those teachings are archived there and ready. So we're looking here at the role of leaders in shaping a network, the important aspect that particularly 2 kinds of leaders that you've heard us talk about before, but now you see it in more of a practical sense here. Just to reflect and review on a few things from our last session, which was way back in December, but why the meal? The meal is a spiritual event. It's not just something to do and have food together. The meal is what is at the heart of a family gathering together. Christ's Spirit is there in the meal verse. Jesus designed it this way. Jesus often met with his disciples after his resurrection in a meal where their eyes were opened. We bring Christ to the table, and it's an opportunity to love one another in very practical ways. Paul was very critical about the importance of the meal and how it should be practiced and how it should not be practiced, because it was a central event. It was a key feature of the way the church gathered, but it wasn't the only factor, the only way. The discussion afterwards, which we call the symposium, the meal was known as the deepnon. The symposion was the time of discussion and singing and praying and learning together after that. That is also a spiritual experience, and we see the way that the Spirit works in us through messages, statements, questions, speeches, things like hymns, the teaching that a leader brings, but the discussion that everyone is free to contribute to. We bring together again what Spirit has been doing in our lives. So, what Paul is talking about in the gifts that are in operation there in 1 Corinthians 14, remember 1 Corinthians 11 through 1 Corinthians 14 is the model for what one of these gatherings look like. That's what Paul is intending to do there. There we see his TOPOI, his big idea that he's working with. The church is a family of families, big TOPOI, big idea that organizes all kinds of other things within it. And the church gathers this way as a family of families. Big TOPOI organizes things. use of gifts, how meals are focused, role of men and women, all kinds of the role of leaders. All those ideas are shaped within this bigger idea of topoi, the family of families, the family of families, how it gathers. 1 Corinthians 11-14 is the biblical model. It is the place where we have the pattern of how the churches were intended to gather. And Paul says, these are the traditions. There are no other traditions among the churches. He says that right there in the front end of that section. So again, a topoi is what we're dealing with here, a new subject for many, but again, think of it as a big filing cabinet that has a lot of stuff in it. This is the way Paul is thinking. Paul doesn't talk about a bunch of loose things here and there as if he's scatterbrained. And it's our job today to try to organize his thought. Paul's thought is very organized. He's organized them into these big categories, and everything that he teaches in his letters that's backdropped with the actual history and teaching history of what happened in the book of Acts from Luke. Those things work together and give us a complete picture that's strengthened by the letters of the other apostles and the gospels that say, this is what Jesus has intended all along. Let's look back and see what he was doing, because what he was intended was this pattern of believers, who they are and what they do and why they do it together. So again, it's just a way of holding things in our mind that was a typical pattern of the ancient world that we today have gotten away from, but we need to reconnect with, because it is what organizes the writings that we have in the New Testament, particularly in Paul's letters. It's like a schematic, a framework. And in the case of the meal, for example, we're not told what we need to eat, how to pay for it, who prepares for it, just that it's a banquet or a real meal. So we're free to organize and do all kinds of other things, but in the end, it's a meal together with people gathered around the table. Everyone's free to participate. And the time after the meal as well is not given. So, okay, for 5 minutes you do this, for 10 minutes you do that. There's freedom in that, but there are some general things that need to be happening. Fellowship, prayer, worship, songs, hymns, spiritual songs, teaching in community, discussing, caring for one another, expressing, meeting needs if they may be after the meal together. Again, Paul's concern is the gathering, not just ideas or beliefs. So often we think that Paul's just a transmitter of ideas. He's just kind of willy-nilly pouring theology out in his letters, and it's our job today. It's our job to organize Paul's thoughts. Paul is very, very consistent in what he does, and he's doing it for a reason. What Paul is teaching is training and helping the churches to understand this is who you are, this is how you gather, and this is how you're going to be fully participating in Jesus's mission. They all go together. We're not free to reorganize that thinking or to try to figure out some kind of framework that is not there. The framework is there. Paul has a clear intention in what he's doing. Luke demonstrates that through the teaching history of Acts. Paul understands then that the work of the Spirit and the transforming power of God in people's lives is going to happen within this framework. We expect it to happen in other frameworks or ways that we have created to understand the church or the way the church gathers. And the same effects are not going to happen because they're outside the design that Jesus has transmitted to Paul. Again, Paul is authoritative. Paul, Ephesians 3, 8 to 10, and even on to 11 and 12 is very, very clear. Paul's given the job of revealing the plan that's going to show God's multifaceted wisdom even to the principalities and powers. That's who Paul is. That's Paul's unique role. It's why we have so much writing from him, and it's authoritative for us today. We have to take it seriously and consider the fact that maybe we're not following Paul's plan, and therefore maybe we're not having or seeing the effect that God intends for us to have in the world, because you got to follow the plan. So talking about the role of the Spirit and the idea that everything Paul is teaching is understood to be happening in this context the way the gathering happens. It's given for, and it's made for this type of understanding of the church as a family of families, and how that family of families gathers for the sake of those who are not yet believers and followers in Christ. So what did the early churches know about these gatherings, and particularly the role of leaders? Well, I'm pulling some key ideas from the portion of the encyclical, page 60 to 75 in the small booklet that you have here. What do they know? Well, from the beginning, Paul appointed elders in every church. We see that in the first missionary journey, Acts 13 to 14. Elders are an assumed part of the meeting. It's understood that elders, overseers, shepherd types, they may have one of those titles, but they function the same way. They're part of the meeting. Someone is giving guidance and looking over things, not controlling, not dictating, not doing everything, but is guiding and directing to make sure things that everyone's included and everyone's involved, and are growing in their skillfulness and their ability to do that, regardless of age or station in life. You'll see some things that refer to that in the appendix there, I think starting on page 90 of the encyclical. Please check that out. I've attached it at the end of the reading that you'll be able to click on in the email. Later in Titus, at the beginning of developing authorized assemblies, that's what a church, a gathering is. It's got leaders, and it's understood to be recognized because of the fact that leaders are present. We know elders need to be appointed in every city, probably indicating a cluster of churches. An elder must be able to teach, debate, and refute error, which again is a given in the meeting. This is what elders do. They're to keep the sound doctrine, not make changes to those elements. Titus was training senior elders in sound doctrine to defend the doctrine. This is the role of leaders, which we often call global apostolic or sodal leaders, like a Paul, a Titus, or Timothy, or members of his team, to train local leaders to understand the first principles, to shepherd and guide people in those things, to be able to apply those things, to be living them out in their own lives, and to solve problems with the first principles. These are the things that are the basics of doctrine, what God has done for us, how we respond to what God has done, how we live according to that in a way that's consistent with what God has done for us. Local leaders, elders, shepherds, overseers, those aspiring to that, and to much degree, the leaders of households, men along with their wives, need to be demonstrating these things in order for the churches to be sound and growing and on the right track. There's also a balanced aspect of apostolic gifted leaders, that's that sodality, global focused leaders, who needed freedom to move among the gatherings. It's attested to in the Didache. That's a second century document. You see evidence of this team, like Paul and his team, that were moving around among churches, helping the local leaders and equipping and solving problems and keeping them all on track. It was throughout cities and among multiple cities. This is key to a network coming together, not just every local house church doing its own things, but a team that unites them and brings them together and builds a common foundation of teaching. Beside that, anyone could bring a teaching through song or a prophetic word. So everybody's participating in the churches with some direction and guidance and shape, according to Paul's teaching in the way the church is gathered. But for the most part, it's an assembly of everyone who is there, spirit-led, empowered by God to bring teaching and to help in teaching one another with the oversight of trained leaders. And also remember Timothy and Titus. Timothy was to follow Paul's instructions, see to it that the churches embrace the sound doctrine. They can make changes to those elements. Titus was training senior elders in sound doctrine to defend the doctrine. You see that in a couple of passages we'll look at here in a minute. 1 Timothy 3:14 to 15. Why did Paul write the letters to Timothy, particularly the first letter? I'm writing these things to you now, even though I hope to be with you soon, so that if I'm delayed, you will know how much people must conduct themselves in the household of God, this is the church of the living God, which is the pillar and the support of the truth. Paul is not just interested in ideas. He's interested in how those ideas work themselves out practically in people's lives, individually, as families, and as churches. Hence, Paul's interest in how they gather. This would have been understood by Timothy and assumed by Paul in his writing to Timothy about the role of men and women, and how you take care of widows, and how you qualify who's a qualified elder or deacon, leading women, things like that. He says similar to Titus, "So I left you on the island of Crete so you could complete our work there and appoint elders in each town as I instructed. Unless there were local leaders shepherding, guiding these churches, or a cluster of churches, house churches meeting in a city, it was not duly constituted. It was not the kind of gathering yet that was complete and able to go on its own and really be a fully functioning part of the network of churches that Paul had given shape to, from Jerusalem all the way to modern day Albania and even on to Rome, which he had planned to go on and do more in Spain, according to his letter to the Roman church. So we have a complete picture in the New Testament about what leaders do and what the churches do and believers within it are to be doing in order to see Christ's plan established, but also grow and spontaneously expand in ways that you just never expected or could never have planned, but doing similar kinds of things. And that's the way it happened in those first 3 centuries of the church. So this role of leaders and their tasks together, it all works together with all these elements working together and held in tension. The balance of apostolic leaders and local elders. Again, you don't just have local elders or shepherds, you also have apostolic leaders moving around among them. 2 of Paul's main topoi, the household of families, and the gathering, and acts as a framework for building networks of clusters and assemblies. In other words, Acts gives you the big plan. That's what we need to do. Something built on the prototype and the model of what we see in the book of Acts. We have to do things like that. And Paul's letters give us the specifics of how to go about doing that. They work together. These gatherings could grow strong and multiply through cities and eventually the whole empire. Christ was building his gathering of gatherings. So again, the New Testament is a story that catechizes us or teaches us how to go about Jesus's work today. It's not just got bits and pieces that we can take and rearrange into ways that we think work best today. We have to keep the whole. It's a whole plan that Jesus entrusted to the apostles, and it's been passed on to us, but it's changed over the years. And it's changed in ways that we're now seeing are not producing the kind of fruit that particular times in church history that it has. And the time has come to return to the way of Christ and the apostles in their terms of understanding these ideas of the church as a families, how a families gathers, and how you build a network of those. And it's happening in parts of the world where the Western church and our Western traditions, Western Europe, North America, have not had any influence. The church exploding in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, that's been a work of the Spirit. And it's very much like the early part of the book of Acts, where you see just this explosion of growth. But it's not just a growth, it's about establishing those churches and develop them into this kind of a network that can continue on generation after generation, and not to get to where we are today, where so many people call themselves a Christian, but don't know anything about the church, don't know anything about their faith, and their lives really aren't distinguished at all from the non-believers around them. That's nominalism. That is not the Christianity of the early church or of the New Testament. That's cultural Christianity, and that's where everything will go if we move away from Christ's plan. Christ's plan is meant to shape and to change that and to keep that fresh and new and challenging in each and every generation. And that's the challenge we face right now. I quote unquote Christian country. We're not a Christian country. Look at what's happening around us. There is no such thing as a Christian country. There are followers of Jesus within countries all over the world. And some are more close to the plan of Christ than others are, and you see the effects. Even why does the church grow and prosper in parts of the world where the government is set against Christianity? Because they're working according to the plan or closer to the plan than in other places. We have absolute freedom to serve Christ for the gospel, but yet no impact, no challenge. Children leaving the faith, people not interested at all or thinking Christianity is irrelevant. What's going on? Christ's plan is either being closely adhered to or bits and pieces of it, and it needs to change. You see, this has happened over a long period of time, and the writing talks about the study in Rome that just in 3 centuries you begin to see, actually 5 centuries, you begin to see the little changes that start happening in the church, moving away from Christ's plan to changing this, altering that, and particularly in the area of leadership. And he talks about the kind of growth that the church saw in those first 3 centuries. The percentage of the population that was Christian grew dramatically over the first 3 centuries. And they kept the basic structure of this house church network, gathering this way, and the meal at the core of their meetings. Sending the Eucharist was part of the proof that the meal became central. In other words, what one house church would do would take part of the food that they had been shared and send it with a messenger to one of the other churches to remember them, oh, we're all connected together. You are family with us. We're sharing part of ours. And you can imagine that happening among a group of churches. But the problem was cracks in the paradigm. And again, the paradigm is the big model that organizes everything. It's sort of the rules of the game, if you will. There's a paradigm of European football and there's a paradigm of American football. They're 2 very different things, but they both share the name football. You got to understand some of the rules and the values within them to understand what the differences are. Some of the churches got away from the core teaching that we see given to Titus and Timothy, for example. So you have a variety of teachings going on in some of the churches. Some of the leaders became more of a title figure and having an institutional authority by virtue of just the office itself, rather than built on the plan of Christ. Leaders have authority because they're working according to the plan of Christ. Any kind of other authority is a man-made authority and it becomes institutional. Why do we have all kinds of churches around in all kinds of traditions, and they have all kinds of different sets of rules and ways of operating? They're man-made systems. They're moved to an institution away from the plan of Christ. Jesus prayed for one church, not institutional churches all over the place. It's a big problem. And we have to be convinced that it's a problem for Jesus, because he prayed that we would be one as he and the Father were one, and we're not one because we've moved away from his plan. City church networks are asking the Roman church for doctrinal decisions. So rather than, again, drawing on the teaching of the apostles, they began to appeal to particularly leaders in particular cities, mainly Rome. The Roman bishop became very important, and it was sort of the precursor to what we now have as the popes of the Catholic Church. Rome is where they're all imagined, but there was a lot going on behind the scenes earlier on than just the 11th or 12th century, when the Roman Catholic West and the Eastern Orthodox East split. Apostolic teams were gone. So you no longer really had this team of leaders moving around among the churches like Paul and his team, a very large team, but you had people doing different things here and there, but it was not integrated. It was not part of one mission. And, it was pretty much reduced to monks in monasteries at that point, who really weren't doing anything except, helping in the particular region, but not giving instruction authority to churches. They weren't that kind of leader. That had been gone. So these are things that small cracks over time with a lot of pressure become big cracks and actually can bring down an entire building. And that's one way of thinking about this. These are small changes in the beginning, and over time, and with cultural pressures and all kinds of things that are thought of uncritically, it can bring down the whole structure, the whole plan. So how do we get back to this today? Well, how to get back to something that looks more like Jesus's plan. And, churches would fall into 2 categories today in most parts of the world. Some have buildings, some don't have buildings. What do you do when you have a building and you want to restructure yourself into a network of house churches? Well, depending on the size of the building, could be all kinds of things. But please understand, buildings require a huge amount of resources. Sometimes more than half of the budget of the church goes into just maintaining and caring for that building. That money then does not go into the development of people, the development of leaders, the multiplication of communities. It gets stuck into bricks and mortar, which again, serve a purpose, but they're not the primary purpose. So these are things that have to be wrestled with for churches in this day and age. And most crises that many churches come to is the fact that they're not growing and they cannot maintain the expense of a building anymore, and either merge with another congregation or sell it off to someone else who are eventually going to come into the same problem again a generation or two down the line. It doesn't have to be that way. And buildings are necessary at some point. So what does that mean? Well, there are two options here for churches that do have buildings, and this includes most churches in North America and the West, but some in the developing world as well. Turn the church, in other words, the group of people that meet there, into a network of small churches, mostly in homes. Doesn't say totally in homes, but if it can be, that's the ideal. Begin restructuring your church building into a resource center for your churches, new churches in the community. In other words, a building then functions to help strengthen what's going on primarily in the homes around meals and the discussions afterwards. It also becomes a center for the community where the community can be introduced to the larger network of churches, or other things can happen that can't happen in homes, outreach events, community events, churches becoming places where people come for voting, where people come for learning languages, where people come, all sorts of things that can serve. That's a resource center. It's not the church. It is a tool for a network of churches. The church is the people. You'll notice in the videos that we've shared from Francis Chan's example again, and we're just looking at that as a possibility of, what something like this might look like. The title, they call their network "We Are Church," which means the people are church. You don't have to have buildings, and most churches in the world do not have buildings, but they are millions of people, and they're part of local churches and networks of them. So the idea, we need to strike from our vocabulary referring to the building as the church. It's the church building. It's the church campus. It's a tool that represents or does something for us, we who are the church, meeting in these gatherings. It has to serve that. If it doesn't serve that and can't serve as a resource to the network and for the community to build and grow that network, or even to train other churches to do the same, then is it an asset or is it a liability? That's a hard question to ask, but one that has to be asked. And we believe there at Grace Church that we have a great asset here, not only to serve our network of churches, but as a way for training and for all sorts of other kinds of things to help build that 3-city network. This is what we're talking about, trying to bring other churches into this project, this journey of reorienting themselves closer to Christ's plan and helping leaders to think through the possibilities and what it would look like to do that. So imagine other churches and church networks in Clifton, Patterson, and Passaic doing the same thing that we've been doing over this number of years, but now being able to learn from our example and to see what we're doing. And because we're doing it well and we're doing it with passion and with commitment, because we're convinced that this is Jesus's plan and Jesus's way. And we're not proud or arrogant about that, but we're confident in it. We're convicted by it, and we're given to it as a way of, as what it means to follow Jesus. Follow him into his church, this kind of church, and to be on his mission together. The other option for churches with buildings is to gradually restructure, start something new with inside of it, and then begin reimagining what church buildings would be for. Some churches very, very hard to change, and it would disrupt everything to do that, to do it quickly. But starting something new inside of it would be the way to go. This is really more in line with what the church in Kiev and Ukraine that we've been working with is starting something new and fresh within it with a young group of people who have the freedom to do that while maintaining the old, where eventually the new will replace the old. And we've done some of that somewhat with us, but involved everybody ourselves by doing home churches for a number of years. Our idea of meeting around a meal and a discussion time together is not new. We've been doing that for years, but now we're making it central and more often than what would traditionally be looked at as a Sunday morning service, which is, again, part of the institutional church and not what is central to Jesus's plan, the meal and the discussion time around it. Churches without buildings need to think carefully about that. Set your churches in order, and then buy buildings or make buildings or establish resource centers at needed. So imagine a church that began and has 10 or 15 house churches, and now they say, boy, we need an office space, we need a place to do other things, we need a larger meeting site, we'd like to reach out to the community in ways that we can't from our homes. Now we need to buy a storefront somewhere. Now we need to buy or need to rent some kind of a space that really helps us go further without it replacing the centrality of the meal and the discussion as who we are and how we gather together. Properly structured for new church planting networks, avoid Western church building that serve the service paradigm. Again, why do we build buildings? It's after basically the Western tradition that started with the Catholic Church that gathers everybody together in one space. The Eastern Orthodox do the same too, and define and gives and institutionalizes what Jesus meant to be driven by mission out there in the world. And mission is rooted in our relationships, our neighborhoods, and our homes. That's how the church grew. And the church stops growing when you bottleneck it and confine it to four walls and defined primarily as a service of some type. So again, when buildings are needed, resource centers are needed, it's because it serves what's already going on and will help it grow, that network grow even further. So is this for us today? Well, Acts is catechetical. In other words, Acts is not just merely a history lesson. Acts is where the plan of Christ is revealed in the model and the prototype of the early churches. If we believe that, then we need to do something about it. And all churches and all leaders need to do something about that. We will be held accountable by Jesus, who continues to do what he's doing and teaching through the apostles by the Spirit's leading in the book of Acts. Acts is not anything less than what Jesus is teaching in the Gospels. It is actually what Jesus was leading to from the Gospels. And so we need to take Acts seriously as a catechism, serious ordered learning that we need to go through and then live in accordance with. The letters of Paul are in the New Testament canon. Why included all these things? Paul's authoritative. Paul's working within the unique revealing of the plan among the Gentiles, not only in the gospel for them too, but also for the way in which this network of churches is formed. So Paul's letters are emerge out of the context of what we see Luke describing in Acts. Christ has a grand strategy as well as clear directions for his assemblies to follow. Jesus has not left us without a plan, and Jesus has not given us the freedom to develop our own anywhere at any time. But we have slowly moved away from it, and all kinds of plans are now out there, and that is not what Jesus intended. We need to stop, and we need to, as leaders in churches, go back to Christ's plan, which will be expressed in different ways, but it all be working in one plan. According to Paul, Jesus gave him these instructions for these assemblies. Again, 1 Corinthians 11-14. There is no other tradition that's been given for the churches. This is the tradition. There's no traditions. We need to, every tradition or anything has to be rooted back to the tradition that we see in the early churches. The household texts, both for families and for his assemblies, match the Greek household and city codes. We would never throw them out. So we're going to throw out the teaching on husbands and wives, parents and children, older women, younger women. We're going to, that's an idea that is central to who the church is and how it functions. So neither can we throw out the meal symposium TOPOI, that big idea of Paul, organizing idea of Paul, because it was also in the culture of the times. Christ's gathering and gatherings are perfect, and even Satan cannot stop their growth and expansion. When Jesus said, "I will build my church," he was not talking about buildings. He was not talking about traditions of men. He was talking about these things: a family of families, and a family of families that gathers in a certain way that multiplies and grows, city to city and country to country, culture to culture. Christ's assembly or assembly's paradigm has always had plenty of room for global culture down through the centuries. So when you go into a Chinese house church, or an Albanian house church, or a Ukrainian house church, or an African house church, you would see things very different, but you would know you were part of the same thing, that this is the gathering. This is Jesus's people gathered together. Even if you didn't know the language, you would know and feel which are part of one global family. And that's what Christ intended all along. And that's what the world needs to see, that there is something that unites all people, that we're not just a bunch of tribes trying to get along together, but we are actually intended to be one people, one global family. And it gets right down to this issue of the gathering, the practical way in which God's people meet. That is the mission. The mission is right there, and the gospel is right there for people to see, not only in symbol and word, but actually in the way people relate to one another. Please note carefully Appendix 2 on page 90. That's really helpful. How does it help envision leadership for Grace Network churches in Clifton and beyond? Think through that. If we were to become 20 house churches, and 15 in Patterson and 12 in Passaic, for example, what would leadership look like among them? How would that function? That appendix will really help you think through that. So please review that and look at that before Sunday, and we can talk about it in practicality and in detail, and it helps you understand how we are structured as leaders, and even particularly how my role is, even at a distance, and how it would be related to the way that we're going to be doing work here in Indiana, where we are. We will be developing a network of these churches starting heavily in 2023. As according to my plan, the plans we laid out with you, from July on to the end of the year, I'm going to really begin to inform you about what's going on here, so that you can be praying about it and laying the groundwork for us to really, really see a strong beginning to a network of house churches in this county where we live, which is what our plan is, but starting in the strategic city, the county seat where we live right now, and beginning right here in our home, which we bought specifically for that purpose, not just as a place for our family, but as a place to begin gatherings together. So we hope you'll follow that. So just again, a kind of a closing statement from the gathering in this last session that we're looking at. May the Spirit lead us in the way of Christ and his apostles in our networks of gatherings, and in giving shape to the emerging next Christendom. Christianity that's been operating for many hundreds of years is being replaced now, very, very rapidly, and because most of the activity that is happening in Christianity is now in the global South, completely outside the system that we in the West have enjoyed for, or have known, I should say, for hundreds of years. That's what we mean, the global South. The Spirit's work outside the Western Christendom paradigm. Without understanding the gathering and placing at the heart of the emerging next Christendom, there will be no next Christendom, but only a continued Western institutionalized Christendom, which will continue to decline. Christianity, as we've known it in the West, is on the fall, and it continues to shrink and continues to have all kinds of problems. And COVID has accelerated that, scandals have accelerated that, and just global culture has accelerated that. If we're to see Christianity become the strong and growing, multiplying movement that it was in the early churches, we need to get back to the very simple ideas, even at the level of gathering, that's been described here, alongside all the other things that are in Paul's major categories of thinking, first principles, and the things that you see there, the way leaders are trained, what it means to be good news and share good news. All of those things need to be rethought. So submit that to you to look at for the next day or two, and look forward to getting together with you on Sunday 10 a.m. to celebrate together, sing together, pray together, but also to learn together in this larger gathering of all the gatherings that we have as well. So with that, just want to thank you for getting your prayers and for your commitment to going back to the way of Christ and the apostles in these practical things. Again, not a matter of style or preference, but a matter of obedience. Gathering as a family of families in these home settings is a matter of obeying Jesus. And so I hope you're all convinced of that and become more and more convinced and enthusiastic as you experience these things and the Spirit guides and teaches us. So God bless.